I'm JG Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Independent media matters, and your support makes it possible. If Parallax Views has challenged your thinking, exposed you to new ideas, or simply kept you company on your commute, now's the time to help sustain it. Listen, share, and if you can, support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you want, you can also make a one-time donation by contacting me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. I can give you a link to my PayPal page if you contact me that way. Let's show what listener-supported media can do. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, Omar Zahzah, author of Terms of Servitude, Zionism, Silicon Valley, and Digital Settler Colonialism in the Palestinian Liberation Struggle, joins the program to discuss the role Big Tech is playing in the censorship of pro-Palestinian voices. Before we begin the conversation, I'd like to remind you that you can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. I only have one sponsor, the mighty Mike Swanson of Wall Street Window. Aside from him, it is you, the listener, that makes this show possible. So if you can, support me on Patreon, patreon.com/parallaxviews. Also, be sure to check out wallstreetwindow.com, the website of the aforementioned Mike Swanson. He has a great trading and financial newsletter. I've actually had listeners make a return on investment from Mike's trading tips. So check out wallstreetwindow.com, where you can also get Mike's free ebook. If you sign up for his newsletter, the ebook is called The Twofold Formula, the single best trading pattern I have ever used. One more time, that's wallstreetwindow.com. And with that being said, let's get right to the conversation. Welcome to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm very happy to be speaking with. Omar Zahzah is the author of a new book out from our friends at Seven Stories Press, I believe, entitled Terms of Servitude, Zionism, Silicon Valley, and Digital Settler Colonialism in the Palestinian Liberation Struggle. How are you doing?
Doing very well. Happy to be here.
So I think my listeners are very familiar with Israel-Palestine and the issues at work there, not just for the past 2 years, but I've been covering this for some time. So I think people know the basics on that. I think what people may be interested to hear about is how Silicon Valley is playing a role in how we talk about Palestine and how there's censorship going on. How did you end up wanting to cover this topic? What was your gateway?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. It really started for me around the tail end, I'd say, of 2021. Some of your listeners may recall that's about the time that you start to see activism from Palestinians in the occupied East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, right? And they're protesting their impending looming expulsion from their homes, basically by the Israeli state. And they take to, among other things, social media to not only protest their, impending expulsion, but they also start to really advance new narratives about the Palestinian struggle, or I should say, narratives about the Palestinian struggle that start to be taken up in new ways. They start to spread more predominantly than we'd seen in previous years. And so for some reason, Sheikh Jarrah and their organizing and activism, which eventually spills over into the 2022 Unity Intifada, it just really has this broader virality that makes I would say, the culture industry at large start to take more and more notice, to the extent where you start to have, people like Muhammad al-Kurd, who, was one of the main individuals involved, Palestinian poet and journalist, be platformed by outlets like CNN to talk, again, not just about Sheikh Jarrah, not just about the specific form of repression they're facing, but Palestine. And you start to see at least a broader kind of receptivity to reconsiderations of thinking about the Palestinian struggle in the larger legacy media industry than, again, I think we had seen for many years. And so I found myself in this moment already kind of intrigued by how you have these emerging platforms, right? These kind of digital social media platforms lending themselves to being these vehicles for counter-hegemonic expressions about Palestine that eventually start to even have noticeable impacts on the broader legacy media itself, which, as many of us know, has been one of the arch censors, classically, of Palestine, of the Palestinian struggle. And what I was also interested by is, as you're able to palpably trace this impact, these same newer platforms that had built themselves on being the vehicles for democracy, the instruments of, a truly democratic and let's say, kind of alternative discourse producing spaces, they start to roll back those gains and they start to mass censor posts about Sheikh Jarrah, about, incursions into the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and about the most recent bombing campaigns in the Gaza Strip in 2022. So I was really fascinated by this paradox where, on the one hand, you have these spaces and these tools that had, however, inadvertently lent themselves to being platforms for counter-hegemonic expression, then they turn right around and start to roll back those gains. So I found myself really intrigued by this contrast. And I also felt that, given that we were at a moment in time, again, this is, the 2021, 2022, where we're starting to see a lot of broader criticism and writing about how big tech fortifies systems of oppression and racism, anti-Black racism, misogyny. Yet here we have a very patent example of how they are, enforcing a targeted form of racism against Palestinians by censoring them en masse, right? And so, over time, I felt that it was important to start to give expression to the particular contours of this specific form of targeting of an entire group of people, and really think through how digital spaces, Silicon Valley, fortify the broader Israeli settler colonial project. So how digital spaces are weaponized to better fortify physical processes of expulsion and dispossession, and, as we've seen most recently, genocide.
If you could, you mentioned that term counter-hegemonic. If I have listeners that are newer or not familiar with that term, what do we mean by hegemonic and counter-hegemonic narratives?
Yeah, great question. So very broadly, when we talk about hegemony, we are talking about the conditions whereby views or patterns of thought that are the most advantageous for um, individuals in the highest echelons of power to have the rest of the populace believe are kind of naturally fortified in the cultural realm, right? So I talk about hegemony by going through Edward Said, who's going through Antonio Gramsci, right? But so classically, you have this distinction between the political sphere and between civil society. Civil society is supposed to be the realm of culture, the exchange of ideas. It's supposed to be distinct to a certain extent from the political sphere, where you have the military, you have the police, you have direct forms of political coercion. But what happens under a hegemonic system is that, culture becomes the place whereby the views and the beliefs most advantageous to power become normalized. So even though we have this supposed distinction, you actually have a media apparatus that fortifies, right, the political status quo that is most advantageous to, geo-imperial policy, for example. So the media is often not the critical voice that it, bills itself as being, but is often something that does what we also refer to as manufacturing consent, meaning creating these systems and patterns of thought and then reinforcing them that lead the majority of people to think along the lines that, say, Washington would want them to think, right? So classically, that's how I, went about it in the book. And again, I think with the paradox that we were just talking about it earlier, I think these platforms are such an interesting and yet also urgent example to think about questions of hegemony and counter-hegemonic patterns of thought.
One really interesting, there were two lines that stood out to me in your preface that I wanted to mention and then have you comment on them and expound on them. You write in the preface, spectacles of political fixation on the social ills of big tech deflect from the tech industry's deep entrenchment in the dominant U.S. political order. The most convention, the most conventionally reviled aspects of big tech's modus operandi are often the very practices the political order finds the most beneficial. I want you to expound on that a bit more because there's these narratives you hear from, on both sides of the political aisle that, oh, big tech is bad, it's hurting the kids. And there's also the narrative that big tech is liberating. It's allowing more discussion. But I think both of those narratives ignore what you're talking about, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, ultimately, what I, come back to again and again in the book and what I, have come up against as, somebody who's, not only writing but now trying to speak about these things at length is that when you're talking about tech, the big tech industry, you find yourself really having to be careful about not reinforcing either an overly fatalistic idea of the impacts of big tech or an overly optimistic or even propagandistic idea, right? Because of course, the people in these industries are probably still very keen on having us believe the types of things that we were hearing, since the early 2010s, right? Like big tech is a force of liberation. It's going to revolutionize society. Probably they've gotten a little more cynical since then. Like I don't think somebody's necessarily going to say an Apple changed the world in the way they might have said it, with no sense of irony or anything of that nature. But by and large, there is still this need to have people believe that these products actually are, working for the greater good and that they are helping people. And on the other end, you have this notion that big tech itself is the, ultimate catalyst of doom, and, Silicon Valley is just this sort of, consortium of, evil supervillains who have already taken over everything and there's nothing we can do and we need to give up. And so I was talking about that on the one hand, right? Like we need to be critical of both views because, big tech, like any other dominant industry, is very much aligned with the centers of power, geo-imperial power. It's not an accident that that has happened. And it's not surprising given as, what we've seen every other industry prior to them replicate, including, the legacy corporate media. And then on the other hand, we want to make sure that we're not completely surrendering, our sense of possibility, our sense of the urgency of resistance, because there's something that's also very advantageous, even if it's a negative view, assuming that, the people who represent this industry have already won is basically ceding ground to them and is doing them a huge favor because, then you don't resist anymore. You have this sense of nothing can be changed. That also goes back to hegemony, because if you believe that nothing can be done, you're already, better servicing power by just, short-circuiting your own resistance. But something else I was also talking about is that tech criticism has become kind of normalized at this point, right? We've seen a lot of the various pratfalls of big tech as an industry. A lot of people generally are dissatisfied with the way that these companies and their products work. However, we may, bill ourselves politically, I would venture to guess that the majority of people are not happy with the rampant surveillance and data mining that these companies do. So that's even aside from Palestine for a second. Like I think in general, there's this sense that this is, kind of an industry that's off the rails, that is kind of doing whatever it wants. And, people are generally dissatisfied. So part of what I was also saying is that to a certain extent, people can give voice to perspectives that seem like they're a genuinely populist perspective in voicing criticism, but they may not necessarily be opposed to the broader system that big tech's success is premised upon. So even if people talk about, well, big tech is hurting the kids, we need to regulate it, right? Is this a voice that is actually, a critical anti-imperialist perspective, or is it something that's giving kind of a cosmetic critique that by and large doesn't reveal how they're basically on board with, the system working as it should be working, right? Including the broader interests that big tech hegemony ultimately fortifies, including imperialism, and including the the capitalism, essentially, as we know it, and the exploitation and the extraction inherent to that.
Let's get into that term that you use in the book and in the title, Digital Settler Colonialism. For my listeners, what do you mean by that?
By digital settler colonialism, I'm taking a term that, I'm not the first person to use it, but conventionally refers to how digital spaces are weaponized to reinforce physical processes of settler colonization. And so essentially, for people who may have questions about that, settler colonialism classically refers to the seizure of land, by a settler population and the expulsion of the indigenous population, and often the transformation of the topography of that land to better align with the political projects and even the imaginaries of the settler, right? But so digital settler colonialism is a term that talks about how digital spaces and digital products are optimized in order to better facilitate physical processes of the expulsion of indigenous populations. And in this case, I'm talking about the Palestinian people. But what I also try to capture in this term, which is what I think makes the book a little bit distinct, is that I also really try to emphasize that digital settler colonialism, as we are experiencing it in the Palestinian context, is the result of an active collaboration between the predominantly US big tech industry and the Israeli settler colonial project, the Israeli state. So even as time and time again, we continue to see big tech be on the wrong side of struggles against injustice, right? There's nothing inevitable about the fact that these companies would end up supporting, say, a settler colonial regime, or fully enabling a genocide through content moderation policies or through collaborations around artificial intelligence, right? All of these things are active choices that these companies have made to better meet their own bottom lines, right? So what I try to emphasize is that digital settler colonialism is this weaponization of digital spaces to better facilitate physical processes of colonization, expulsion, and genocide, but that it's also manifesting at the scale that it is as a result of an active choice of two different actors, distinct yet, overlapping actors, the Israeli state and the US big tech industry. And I feel it's important not to lose that point, because sometimes when we get very invested in kind of keeping all the receipts of the ways in which big tech is oppressive, we can kind of lose sight of the fact that everything they have done is a result of a choice that they have made, right? And so there's nothing inevitable about them doing the things that they do. They're choosing to do it. And we need to understand this is a collaboration precisely so we know which sides of the aisle that we need to be fighting on in our resistance.
I want to talk more about that collaboration because while reading your book, I was actually thinking about there's this American entrepreneur, big tech figure out of San Francisco named Balaji Srinivasan. Very reactionary figure. I think he runs the company Coinbase. But he's talked about how he wants a sort of tech Zionism in San Francisco. We need to get rid of the sort of Democrats and the progressives, the way Zionism is trying to get rid of Palestinians. And I was reminded of that, not just reading your book, but also based on what you just said, that there's this sort of collaboration going on. So a character like Srinivasan sees a lot of value in Zionism. He wants the tech version of it, big tech's version of it, where they can get rid of their competition or their the people they see as their enemies. Why is there this collaboration, though? I'm curious. What brings big tech and these Zionist lobbyists and supporters together?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, the Srinivasan's tech Zionism, I think, is such a really relevant and interesting example to sit with. Because what I think it reveals is that to a certain extent, regardless of its literal feasibility or its literal application, what we see from a formulation like this, like Srinivasan's tech Zionism, or this idea of these exclusive spaces, that are completely cleansed, quote unquote, right, of the progressive or the undesirable populations, is that there is a natural affinity between Zionism and between other forces of extraction, exploitation, and oppression, right? So the heart of big tech, as I think we've seen, right, is not progressive. Um, it's not, well, maybe it's progressive in kind of a compromise sense, but it's not authentically liberatory, even though it will claim that mantle, right? Well, we've seen it align very happily with some of the most reactionary and fascist forces and impulses. And so I think what happens is that there is a natural alignment between Zionism, which is a project of settler colonialism, expulsion, total domination of land and resources, and big tech, which has very much of the same kind of tendencies, right? This tendency toward the constant colonization of resources, of space, of materials, of political domination, of suppression of the very collective rights that many of these individuals started out, touting their products to represent. So I think there's such a natural alignment because many of the same values are held by both Zionists and by, proponents of big tech or individuals in the big tech industry. And of course, there's also an alignment because people understand that material collaboration is the best way for them to realize those inherently oppressive, anti-democratic projects and goals.
I want to get into how big tech and terms of service on these social media platforms can lead to censorship. Can you delve into that a bit for my audience? The ways in which the distinction between, say, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is often just erased, and I think there's a lot of danger in that.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. So, um, classically, when you go on a social media platform, right, you're going to have at least two sets of guidelines. One is what they refer to as community standards, and the other is what they refer to as terms of service. The terms of service, they're a bit more of the legal uh, regulations, let's say, or the terms under which a platform will regulate speech based more so on legal concerns, right? And then the community standards are a little bit looser, but they're basically also kind of guidelines or etiquette for conduct on the platform. And they speak to this kind of imagined community of people, and they've kind of premised themselves on making sure that ostensibly, right? Nobody feels unsafe. Nobody feels, unable to speak. Everybody feels welcome. They'll use kind of buzzwords and values along those lines. So you will have both operative, within platforms. And so what's been happening increasingly, and I think Meta is the primary example, or I should say maybe kind of even the pioneer in this regard, is you start to have a phenomenon whereby platforms really bake the conflation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism into the terms under which they practice their content moderation. So, Meta had several instances, and then I think in 2024 officially rolled out a newly revamped kind of policy on anti-Zionist expression, right? So the premises under which it would regulate the um, anti-Zionist speech, right? And it's very clear when you read basically the fine print of that there is a very clear kind of conflation between Jewish identity and between Zionism, you know. And so what starts to happen is these companies will create these community standards, or they'll call them sometimes their hate conduct policies or policies on hateful speech. And, Meta was one with its anti-Zionist policy. And again, I think this was 2024, that basically said the conditions under which it would increasingly police anti-Zionist expression, often under the premise of making sure that Zionist is not used as a proxy for Jew, which, I think in the abstract, if you hear that, you can say, okay, maybe that's not so terrible. But then you actually read the fine print of some of these things, and there's certain conditions where it's very clear that the line is starting to be blurred. So even one, for example, that talks about denials of right to exist. I mean, what is that except really just an affirmation of, this Israeli PR talking point of Israel's right to exist, right? So what does it mean to say that, again, a political project, should not exist, as a settler colonial enterprise, right? But there's a lot of ambiguity in terms of some of this policing that makes it a little bit more difficult to think about, okay, what is the line at which I'm going to actually be reprimanded or censored for, expressing anti-Zionism? And that ambiguity is also part of the point. I also talk in the book about Twitch, which I believe November of the next year, I would need to double check the date, also came out with a hateful conduct policy regarding Zionism. And I think that that's one of the other dangers of companies doing these things is it kind of sends the signal to other kind of aspiring, platforms that this is sort of the way to conduct the content moderation in your spaces.
So I don't necessarily want to take this too far away from big tech, but I wanted to mention a story I was reading today. Because I think in a lot of ways, what we're talking about is going to end up being there's a bigger picture that's even bigger than big tech here. So there was news that came out in the past day that Paramount, the entertainment and movie company, has reportedly created a blacklist of actors and actresses it has determined to be xenophobic or homophobic. And then the one that was interesting was overtly anti-Semitic. And it's like, well, who decides what's overtly anti-Semitic? And now Paramount is being run by sort of it's MAGA people running it, the Ellisons. What does overly anti-Semitic mean? What does that mean for actors like Javier Bardem or Joaquin Phoenix or Emma Stone, Mark Ruffalo that have been pro-Palestinian in their views? Are they overly anti-Semitic? Are they overtly anti-Semitic according to the Ellisons? Who decides this? And I bring this case up because we're seeing this not just with big tech, but with other companies as well. Can you comment on that? Not necessarily this like Paramount case. You don't have to comment on that if you don't want to, but just the fact that this is bigger than just big tech in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it is bigger than big tech in a lot of ways. And, like one of the things I was thinking about when I first started writing the book was kind of the potential degrees of separation between big tech and the legacy corporate media, right? That there had been this enough of a contrast to produce enough friction to actually kind of nudge at least the way conversations were happening on a broader cultural scale. Now, what's happening with things like these mergers, right, where you have like Larry Ellison, who's going to be basically one of the new owners of TikTok, along through with his co-founded company Oracle, and then his son David, right, who, yeah, is running Paramount. You're seeing all of a sudden this consecration of different forms of both legacy and social media by individuals who are very straightforwardly, pro-Israel, Zionist. And what we saw in terms of even the kind of the takeover of CBS, the appointment of Barry Weiss as the editor-in-chief, it's very clear that we're seeing all these moves to really inhibit the criticism of Israel and Zionism on these different platforms, right? From TikTok, which had this reputation of being kind of the pro-Palestine app, to now the legacy corporate media through the both the new owners as well as the appointments of these new figures who have these editorial powers. Basically, it's clear that things are being skewed toward a pro-Israel perspective, and that these spaces that, however imperfect they were, had at least allowed for some modicum of dissent to spread. There's an attempt to crack down on them even more. So I think we're seeing really the concentration of power, and with that, an even further attempt to censor pro-Palestine and anti-Zionist voices. And I expect that to only increase. So what does overly anti-Semitic mean? It's basically going to mean pro-Palestine or somebody who's even vaguely pro-Palestine, right?
I also wanted to ask you how this connects to past instances of censorship. Specifically, I wanted to mention this in regards to who wrote the forward to your book. Stephen, I don't want to mispronounce his name. I think it's Salatia.
Stephen Salida, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Stephen Salida, who I had wrote the foreword for my book, is very honored that he agreed to do it. He is a really important Palestinian American intellectual, activist, and academic who really had pioneered in many ways the um, comparative literary studies, I should say, between the Palestinian question and settler colonialism in Turtle Island or the United States, basically. So thinking through the connections between Zionism as a settler colonial project as well as the U.S. settler project and ideologies, right? So how are those two processes interconnected? And then I think also, even most importantly, how are the expressions of resistance, among indigenous peoples in Turtle Island and Palestine interconnected with one another too? So that had been, his project and remains his project. But what happened in 2014, he was offered a job by the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and was fired ultimately for his tweets, basically condemning, what was at that time the most recent Israeli bombardment campaign in the Gaza Strip. And, he, for a while, had to go through different positions, was unable to find a new academic job after being unable to renew a position at the American University of Beirut. Worked as a bus driver for a while, continued to produce amazing works of writing, and now, fortunately, is in, I believe, the English department at the American University of Cairo. But so that was a very direct case of censorship for political speech and on social media, of an academic, somebody who was fired basically, literally for opposing, Israeli, now we know it to be genocidal violence, basically, in Gaza, right? And it was revealed through investigations by the Electronic Intifada, which is also an organization I've had the privilege to, work with as a contributor, that it was really donor pressure that had played a large role in, getting the administration to make this decision. So definitely, I think it is relevant in that he's somebody who's experienced the censorship, but I also think it's important because, through that experience, he has remained, unapologetic and steadfast. And I still believe one of the best critics on how kind of corporate appeasement of Zionism is so reflexive in a lot of spaces, including in university spaces. And I think now in this moment, post October 7th, 2023, we're really seeing the gains of that, right? Where you have so many institutions that are completely willing still to throw faculty under the bus, to demonize their students, and to collaborate in suppressing, individuals' rights.
I want to talk specifically about YouTube. I was really interested to speak with you about how YouTube figures into the book because I've had relatively okay experiences with YouTube, with one exception. At one point, I got removed entirely from YouTube for about 24 hours. I wasn't told why. They just said cyberbullying. And I'm like, well, I've never bullied anyone on YouTube or like in the chats or anything. What are they talking about? And they wouldn't tell me what it was based on. And eventually I just went on Twitter and said, well, I've never cyberbullied anyone. I tagged YouTube. And in like literally 20 minutes later, they reinstate my account. But I mentioned this story because dealing with YouTube for that 24-hour period, it was like a Kafka-esque nightmare. It was like something out of the trial. So let's talk about YouTube because I've had experiences with YouTube.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, YouTube is also an important one to talk about. And in fact, I think I just read something this morning. I think I just saw a headline that was saying that YouTube is now implicated in removing, so many videos that are basically providing, ongoing evidence of genocidal violence, basically on the part of Israel. So I don't want to. I don't remember the source from which I read this, but there is this accusation now that YouTube is basically scrubbing its videos that were uploaded by individuals that were supposed to document genocide. And in the book, I also talk about YouTube, right? I'm speaking primarily about the organization Samidun that had their account totally taken down. And so I think YouTube is also an important example. I mean, of course, Google owned. And one of the things that really I think is also important to remember is there had been this narrative around 2016, this sort of Russiagate narrative that, Russia had basically, hacked the election and had, or at the very least, had produced this overwhelming amount of propaganda that really swayed the election in a particular way. And this basically gave a lot of big tech companies the license to lean into censorship all the more by pretending that they were being attuned to so-called accuracy of information. Because of course, there have been accusations for years. These platforms, hew to the right. Some of these are not reliable sources. All those things. So what started to happen is these companies took this as the perfect opportunity to start censoring and downranking leftist content on all their platforms, right? So YouTube was also kind of a case in point for that because it was one of the main, platforms that had been also doing this, right? And so I do think YouTube is also an important one to talk about because we see all of these decisions that are premised as being executed for one rationale, but in reality, often may be reinforcing another project.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's really wild when you get your channel removed and then can't figure out why and have to, you know, finagle something by getting your supporters to tag YouTube to tell them, "Hey, bring me back." But yeah,
Yeah, and it's always opaque. That's the thing. Like, whether it's YouTube or any other place, like this is part of the problem of content moderation is we don't really understand how it works and we're not supposed to, right? We know that generally there's this combination of algorithmic filtration and at times it can also be in, individual, oversight, but we don't know the exact metrics of how that plays out. And oftentimes you can be banned or, suspended for arbitrary reasons that make no sense. And sometimes you'll appeal. Sometimes that appeal will be successful. Sometimes it won't. But you really have no control over the narrative of why you were banned or suspended in the first place. I've even talked to people who said, like, it wasn't until I started threatening legal action that my accounts were restored. But I knew that I had never done any of the things that they'd said I had done. But
so
that's
I'm
the
not
problem.
alone. This has happened to
No,
others.
yeah, this happens to a lot of people and it's becoming increasingly normalized, which I think is part of the issue. Now we're navigating these spaces kind of with this awareness that things can go off the rail very quickly. And we're just hoping that it's, let's just say, as least fatal of a crash as possible or something. But we know generally that there's so much of this, kind of bureaucratic rigmarole that's going to be baked into the process of even going on these places to begin with.
Now, there's this term, well, I guess it's not a term, it's an AI system called Lavender. And I had not heard of this before reading your book, or maybe I had, but I just, it slipped my mind. I feel like this is really important to talk about, though. What is Lavender?
Yeah, Lavender, there's several AI programs. One of them is Lavender. There's also one called The Gospel, and several others as well. But basically, these are targeting programs. These are programs that use artificial intelligence to generate lists of Palestinians and locations to target for bombardment. So they are AI generated kill lists and strike lists, essentially. And it was revealed, during this latest genocide that essentially Israel is relying on AI to generate these kill lists and these target lists of Palestinians. There's also a program called, or I believe it's a tracking program called Where's Daddy that uses AI to help the Israeli state track Palestinians to ensure that they're in their homes before it strikes, right? So it literally is just to kill people in their homes, right? So you have this increasing reliance on artificial intelligence to generate strike lists and kill lists of Palestinians. And of course, there's all of this, again, propaganda about how AI is superior because, it can lead to more accurate results. But the reality is these are just, randomly generated kill lists that are done with no oversight and that are maximizing, the casualty rate and just the total decimation of infrastructure. So yeah, it's one of the most harrowing aspects of this latest genocide, but we're seeing big tech being utilized really to maximize the lethal impacts of military colonial violence through things like these AI generated kill lists and target lists.
If you could, I wanted to talk about how this all ties into the sort of troll armies and, these cases of digital astroturfing that you deal with in the book, like the organization Jew Belong, and maybe you could go over some of these cases of digital astroturfing.
Yeah, definitely. So, a couple of things. I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book, and this actually brings me to one of the other aspects that I was interested in, right? On the one hand, I'm looking at these kind of big tech platforms, the way that they normalize anti-Palestinian content moderation. But something else I was also looking at is how Zionists or the Israeli state itself will really try to game the internet, essentially, right? And so, um, one of the ways that this happens is on a very simple level, you can have something like, a group that's affiliated with the Israeli state, or at least, Zionists who are very pro-Israel and who may have connections or ties, to state institutions. They may start a Facebook group that doesn't present itself as having anything to do with Israel, right? It'll maybe be about some generally um, interesting, niche kind of thing or a progressive cause. But then every so often, it'll start to kind of slip in pro-Israel messaging. That's one very small example of what I mean by when I talk about digital astroturfing is you're going to start to have the creation of these maybe you'll think of them as kind of like Trojan horse groups in a sense. They present themselves one way, but in reality, they have a kind of an ulterior motive for why they're there. And part of it is to just normalize the reflexive support of Israel and Zionism. But I also talked at length about activists who had been targeted by this organization called the Jew Belong, which you were asking about, which essentially is this registered nonprofit group that kind of along the lines of, presenting one thing and doing another, um, bills itself as being a space really for Jewish people to make sure that, they don't think of themselves as being less Jewish than anybody else. Maybe they're not as traditional in some respects, but everybody is part of the same community. So, Jew belong, a kind of a pun, I believe, on you belong. So on its face, that's totally fine, right? But what the organization actually does is it, puts a considerable amount of time and resources into Zionist messaging. Those of us in the Bay Area may recall these hot pink billboards that they put up that usually have, different kind of Zionist slogans or just basically slogans meant to demonize Palestine activism or just delegitimize it. So things like, why are there so many protests for Palestine but none for Myanmar, right? Things like that. And so they kind of set themselves apart by having these hot pink billboards. But what also happened, I believe, around 2022 that I talked about in the book was that for a period, they had also launched this series of prizes called partisan prizes. And they used that to give, I believe it was about $300 or so to people who were staunch partisans or, defenders, basically. Um, and it ended up being of, Israel and of Zionism. And what I talked about in the book, which began as investigations for electronic intifada, was how the recipients of these prizes were actually coordinating, in campaigns of targeted harassment against Palestinian content creators like the co-creators of the Palestine podcast,
I wanted
Morel
to ask
Vernon.
specifically
Yeah,
about that. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So it just basically through the investigation and through talking with people who've been targeted by this, it became clear that these partisan prizes were basically incentivizing this harassment because you were seeing in real time recipients of these prizes going online to talk about how they had, quote unquote, succeeded in getting the Palestine Pod Instagram account taken down. We can do it again. So what they tried to do, and what I talked about in my reporting was there was active outreach on their part to Meta saying, look, we have the receipts. This is incentivized harassment on your platforms. We're being mass reported, with the express intent of taking us down. Everything is documented. And, they weren't able to get any support because they were told things like, well, reporting is not a violation of our community standards, so there's nothing we can do, even though what they're saying is your rules are being gamed to better facilitate our harassment, right? So, um, you know, that was something else that I had gone into is that often it's not just that you have these moderation policies that, will take for granted the false conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. It's also often that you have groups and organizations, often Israeli aligned, that are able to game the system to really manipulate those roles to continue to maximize the inability of people who are trying to speak out for Palestine to have access to that platform in the first place. And of course, when you get down to moderation too, it's a question of what do you consider to be a violation or not? And your judgment on that is really based on, to a large extent, I would argue, how much you take for granted the defamation that is made about particular types of content. So, how much you do believe that talking about Palestine is already controversial. Maybe then we shouldn't be surprised that these groups are being mass reported. Maybe this is normal. Maybe this is okay, right? So I think a lot of it comes down to the issues of the kind of the opacity of this process and how a lot of it seems to come down to decisions that we have no real input over or control over. But nevertheless, this was a coordinated campaign of mass harassment, and for a period, it was also being incentivized through the partisan prizes. So that had just been one kind of broader case study of how these things play out online. But of course, you have, the constant creations of different groups that are out to kind of, whitewash genocide or normalize Israel and Zionism. And you always deal with people who are facing harassment on various levels, whether it's through individuals who are gaming systems, whether it's, these AI bots, which have become a little bit more refined over the years, or whether it's, targeted activity even from the Israeli state, which we know is putting, the equivalent of millions of dollars into online hasbara, or propaganda. And we know that, Netanyahu has been meeting very recently with, prominent social media influencers and very outspoken about the fact that, the gaining of TikTok, right, is a huge win, right?
Right.
So
He's
there's an
basically
awareness.
saying that not to interrupt you, but he's basically saying,
Yeah.
TikTok and X are part of Israel's information war.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah. So we know, I mean, this spans all level, and we know that, the internet, social media are as they've expressly said it, they're battlegrounds for them. And so we can expect to be embattled when we continue to, take to these platforms to try to talk about Palestine, Palestinian liberation, and oppose genocide.
I wanted to ask you, there's an organization that comes up in your book. I've actually met people from this organization. I'm talking about Palestine Legal. How
Mhm.
important are these civil rights organizations like Palestine Legal in sort of fighting back against this kind of censorship we've been talking about?
These organizations, it's really impossible to quantify how important they are. I talk a lot in the book, obviously, about the internet and tech, but this idea, it's not just online spaces that are gamed, right? There's also this process, that Zionists openly refer to as lawfare. So the attempt to use even the law itself as a form of warfare. A large part of the crackdown that we're seeing, of people who are outspoken, at universities, at different spaces, a lot of that is made possible by the weaponization of things like civil rights legislation, but weaponizing something like I believe Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, basically to argue that people who are critics of the Israeli project or of Zionism are violating the civil rights of Zionist individuals. And these are complaints that are filed, cases that are filed based on this. Universities launch investigations. So when you have such a strategic, calculated, and massively impactful weaponization of laws and legislation that is meant to minimize collective repression in order to facilitate it, you also need people who understand the law and civil rights, to be advocating on your behalf. So, yeah, these organizations are, astoundingly important. We definitely need legal minds in this moment where the law is one of the primary instances of repression that is intended to silence activism and organizing for Palestine.
I also wanted to ask you about the issue of how sort of content moderation and big tech deals with well, I'll put it this way. I think there's a double standard. When it, I think anti-Semitism is horrible. I also happen to think anti-Arab racism and Islamophobia are horrible. But it seems like there's a double standard where a lot of times anti-Arab racism, I see it in a lot of places and no one calls it out. There's no content moderation. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think it's again, this some of this gets back to, the issues with what is normalized through content moderation and what is not. But I would definitely agree that there's a huge double standard in terms of the allowing of different forms of anti-Arab racism and Islamophobia versus the instances of alleged anti-Semitism, which often actually end up being pro-Palestine sentiment rather than anti-Semitism. Now, I agree, things that are genuinely anti-Semitic, there's no place for them and they shouldn't be there. But the part of the problem that we're in, and I think part of the reason that we have so much content moderation regarding Palestine is that the false conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is so normalized and it's baked into the content moderation policies of the hegemonic big tech companies to the extent that we see an over-policing of anything related to Palestine under this false premise of it being anti-Semitic versus, a lot of the hate and the racist vitriol that people who advocate for Palestine face on a regular basis, right?
Well, we're seeing it right now, right? With
Yeah,
in New York, Mom Donnie just won, and I just see all these posts saying he's going to turn it into a Muslim caliphate and
yeah,
communism and all these Muslims and people posting like 9/11 pictures and say, "Oh, New York has forgot about 9/11," as if like Mom Donnie did 9/11. It's
right.
so bizarre and hateful.
Yeah, and I mean and if people can feel comfortable to not just comfortable but proud to say that out loud, if the media, the legacy media can regularly run those things, it's no wonder that we have social media amplifying the very same double standards. And culturally, anti-Arab racism and Islamophobia is baked into the core of our culture and politics. And that's precisely what's made or helped to make the Israeli project so successful in the first place, is that, there is a broader hegemonic normalization of all of these different forms of racism that Zionism itself relies upon in order to realize its success and in order to inculcate sympathy within the broader public. So, in many ways, part of this work is fighting against those double standards that shape our cultural common sense.
Before we get going, can we talk about the issue of shadow banning? Because that I think that's often not necessarily overlooked, but it's a weird topic because a lot of times people don't even know if they're shadow banned or not.
Exactly, exactly. It's really challenging because most people don't have a big enough follower count to be able to really meaningfully track it. And so when I talked again to come back to Laura Alborno, who's a Palestinian American attorney and co-creator of the Palestine Pod podcast, she was one of my main sources for this because she is very heavily shadow banned on apps like Instagram. And she said I could just tell my follower count is big enough to where if I'm not seeing, a reach of multiple thousands, I post something and I'm maybe only 100, that's like not even a small fraction of my actual follower base, right? It's also tricky because it's one of the forms of suppression that companies don't even admit to doing, right? That's why some critics have even said we shouldn't use the term shadow banning. We should say black box gaslighting because they're gaslighting all of us into pretending that they're not doing what they're very blatantly doing. But so shadow banning works by limiting or completely nuking the reach of a post that you make so that a very small fraction of your followers, if any of them at all, really see it, right? And it's much more difficult to navigate because even if you have a post, like you were talking about your post about your thing about cyberbullying, right? Let's say you have something, you're accused of doing something, and you have a disciplinary measure from these platforms done to you on that account. Maybe it's wrong, but at least there's a process in place. You can appeal it. You can say, I didn't do this. You go through a whole process. Again, they may be biased, they may not actually give you a fair review, but at least you have the mechanism of a review. With shadow banning, you have nothing because you can't prove that it's being done. They're not going to admit to doing it. And so people, instead of being able to do things like go through an appeals process, often have to resort to other measures like, okay, I'm going to mix up my content. So some of it's personal, some of it's Palestine. I'm going to post a different picture that's unrelated to what the content is. Things like that to try and get around the shadow bans to make sure that their content again starts to reach their followers. But yeah, it's one of the trickiest forms of censorship to really navigate because companies don't admit to it, and it's just very difficult to quantify.
Is there anything else I've missed? I know we've been talking about an hour or so here, but is there anything I missed in this conversation that you think is worth pointing out that didn't get brought up so far?
I just think the last thing I would say is that I finished this book being a lot more pessimistic about platforms and a lot more optimistic about people. Um, you know, and by that I just mean that what I realized in working on Terms of Servitude is that throughout history, it's always been the creativity of Palestinian resistance that has enabled Palestinians to repurpose hegemonic forms of media to make them do what they were never supposed to do, which is to become instruments of advocating for Palestinian liberation. So even as big tech has revealed itself to be such a compromised space, it was Palestinian creativity and media resistance that enabled its inadvertent potential. And so I'm very optimistic that that's what's going to happen again. Even as one industry becomes more and more compromised, we're going to continue to find new ways to kind of affect these narrative fissures and cracks.
Well, I want to thank you again, Omar Zahzah, for coming on Parallax Views, and I hope people will check out the book, Terms of Servitude, Zionism, Silicon Valley, and Digital Settler Colonialism in the Palestinian Liberation Struggle.
Thank you so much for having me.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers' credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/Parallax Views, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program. Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.